Day event, I think. And the first in our series of decolonial dialogues. This event is being organized and moderated by Danille Arendse, our own Danille, who's been part of NYI since St. Petersburg, back in St. Petersburg, and is now a pillar of the universe. I will hand it over to Danille, who will tell you about the speakers and the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Polly. I didn't know I was a pillar.
You are.
But without wasting any time, so today's talk is on decoloniality and food. And I'm hoping you all came with some appetite. Excuse the pun. So just to briefly summarize today's talk, it's a collaborative presentation in which they're going to unpack the ways in which traditional food customs of pre-colonial Bengal was colonized by the Europeans, especially the British, and then followed by the Portuguese. And they're also going to reflect on the colonization of food customs and culinary practices, which opened gateways for the Europeans to fragment the traditional society of pre-colonial Bengal socially, culturally, racially, and communally. Then they will also explore the colonization of food in Cape Town, South Africa, where the Dutch brought Bengali families in the middle of the 1600s as enslaved peoples to assist them in setting up a halfway station for their continued colonization of India. So that's very briefly what we'll be speaking about. And then without wasting any time, we're going to start with Professor Rozena Maart. I'll just briefly introduce her before she speaks. So Rozena Maart was born in District 6, the former slave quarter of the Cape. Her family, along with thousands, were forcibly removed in 1973 due to the Groups Areas Act. In 1986, which is actually when I was born, giving my age away, at the age of 24, Rozena was nominated to the Woman of the Year Award in South Africa for her work in the area of gender-based violence and for starting with 4 other women, the first Black feminist organization in South Africa called Women Against Repression. She was also a member of the Biko Rodney Malcolm Coalition in Toronto in the late 1980s, and has conducted research on racism, hosted seminars and workshops at several universities in Ontario and Quebec on dismantling racism. Professor Maart has a long history of more than 35 years of working in the area of Black consciousness, anti-racism, transformation, and decoloniality, as is evidenced by her published papers and edited collections. She's also a research ambassador at the University of Bremen in Germany and a MacArthur Fellow for the Contradiction Studies program, which is hosted by the same university. So thank you very much, Professor Rozena Maart, for joining us, and you may start when you're ready. Rozena, I'm checking if you're fine.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I'm in Toronto, just outside of Toronto, and I just have to say I'm not great with technology, but I have been doing. I don't know if you can see me. I'm trying very hard. You can see the snow in the background, so I'm not in Cape Town or in Durban. I had a lot of problems this morning. I think because the link is on the poster and somehow it didn't work for me, and I had to turn my computer off and turn it back on. So I may have, I'm not going to pull up any of those things anymore. If you see me looking not here, but at the back of my screen, it's because I have another computer. And usually things take a longer time for me to pull them up and all of that. But what I'm going to do just now is, while I wait for this to be pulled up, I actually had a map, but I'll just explain to you for those of you. I don't know how many of you know the actual like physical geography of South Africa. You know that the African continent comes with a point at the bottom. That's Cape Point. And when the Dutch had colonized Bengal and Malaysia and Indonesia before they colonized the Cape. Now, I think many of you know that the spice trade was a very important part of the reasons for colonialism, certainly by the Dutch, who were sent out by the Dutch East India Company. So there was a company that had sent the Dutch out to colonize, the southern part of the Cape, as well as India, which was one of their main, was a very important reason for conquest, because in the 1600s, spices, the value of spices was the same as the value of gold. And so when the Dutch colonized Bengal, and mainly Java was a very important port for them. And then in Malaysia, they brought those enslaved people. So for example, my grandmother's heritage, they were taken from Bengal to Java. And then they had stayed in Java, my mother's ancestry. And then they were brought from Java as human cargo to the Cape. But also along the Eastern Cape, which is my grandfather's family, they were also enslaved and brought to the Cape by the Dutch. So when the Dutch had enslaved people at the Cape, which they brought from these particular regions, they named them after the month of the enslavement. So my surname is Maart, like the third month of the year, January, February, March. And my grandmother was September, and my cousins are April. So it's that part of the history. So I just wanted to situate that a little bit. I'm not reading from my paper because I don't want to waste time just pulling things up and for you to wait any longer. And so there was a concerted effort to make sure that food and the culinary history that the Dutch experienced in Bengal and Malaysia and Java, that culinary history would be brought with the enslaved as human cargo, because so many of these excursions that the Dutch East India Company undertook, of course, there were many deaths. This is before the discovery of oranges and vitamin C that was important to sustain colonizers, during their conquest, especially these long voyages. So they had also their palates became accustomed to what the colonized had cultivated as a livelihood. So one of the most important things is just about the history of colonization at the Cape was the fact that food and setting up a halfway station, because at that stage in the mid 1600s, the spice route to India was to circumvent right around Africa, right around West Africa to the Cape, and then to India. So food and the culinary history of the very people that had colonized was crucial for colonizers setting up the halfway station at the Cape. Of course, they also came into contact with indigenous people like the Goraninkona, which is one of the Xhosa sect. So my grandfather's heritage is Xhosa. So they began to barter with them. They also, so for example, the language that is spoken at the Cape, which is a big contention. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. So the Dutch renamed their language Afrikaans when it became clear in the late 1800s that the fight was going to be over land, and they wanted to assert their ownership to the land by using the term Afrikaners, like we belong in Africa because God had told us to come here, right? So there was that aspect. And it's the same, it's very similar with the question in the late 1700s 1700s, around 1780, between 1780 and 1790, when the French Huguenots, again, commissioned by the French government, well, not commissioned, but they certainly knew of the Cape and thought that the Cape was a very important place for them to be, because there was issues around religion and identity that they didn't feel, they felt ostracized by the then French community. And so South Africa is known today for the wine region of Stellenbosch and Paarl and Franschhoek, with the assumption that it's the French who brought the winemaking culture to the Cape. And that's actually not true. Indigenous people in South Africa had been making wine long before the Dutch ever got there. So the sad part of all of this is that the Dutch colonial government introduced a system called the dopstelsel. So if you want to translate that into English, it means tot. You know, like a tot that you drink for a tot of wine, yes? Or whiskey or whatever it is, a small little glass is called a tot. Is everybody with me? Do you understand what I'm saying here? Yeah? So when the enslaved were coerced and forced to work on the farms, especially the grape farms, which became wine farms, they were never paid in money. They were paid in alcohol. So and that was outlawed, legally outlawed way before 1994, way before the first democratic elections. And yet there were still farmers in South Africa who were still practicing the tot system, the dopstelsel, which means you don't pay people in money for their labor, you pay them in alcohol, which is the perpetuation of alcoholism, which is the perpetuation of not assigning value to any person who works and, you know, whose labor you recognize. So this was part of a history of enslavement, even though after slavery was abolished in Britain, it was meant to be abolished in the Cape. So around 1834, and then by between 1866 and 1868, District 6, which was the old slave quarter, got its name as the 6th municipality of the Cape. And so, for example, people spoke what is known as Kaaps, which is Kaaps, which is the language the enslaved already learned from the Dutch in the 1600s, when they were colonized in Java and Malaysia and Bengal, and brought that to the Cape with the mixture of their own languages. So you will find like the local vernacular, Kaaps, is very different from the formal Afrikaans, the formal traditional Afrikaans that really developed very distinct from the Dutch. But to come back to food, it wasn't only the exploitation of enslaved and people who were forcibly brought as human cargo. It was also the whole wine industry, which is a multi-million-dollar industry in South Africa at the moment. And it was the conditions under which that enslavement and colonization happened, because it was first and foremost the priority of the Dutch East India Company to make as much money as possible from the culinary expertise of the people they enslaved and from the wine expertise of enslaved people who were basically left homeless and landless, but who could live on the farms in very, very small dwellings because their labor, because their winemaking expertise was so crucial for, of course, the generation of wealth and the now reputation that South Africa has as one of the most important winemakers in the world. I'm going to stop there just in the interest of time. I think I can probably, I don't know, I think Sayan and I have a joint paper, but we can send that to you. I just had a lot of difficulty, I think, because the link was on a poster. I don't know why or what happened, but it shut my computer down So I had to restart it, and I have to now retrieve my notes, which I think I'll just leave for now. But I'll hand over to you, Danille, and if there are questions or comments, I will in the meanwhile look for it. And then I'm also here to listen to Sayan's presentation and other comments and input. Thank you.
Thank you, Rozena. You actually finished ahead of time, so I won't complain. But we can move on to Sayan. So just to introduce Dr. Sayan Day, he grew up in Kolkata, West Bengal. He completed a BA in English, an MA in English, and a PhD in English from Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, and is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Wit Center for Diversity Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He's also a faculty fellow at the Harriet Tubman Institute at York University in Canada. As a contributor and editor, his publications appear in different edited books, journals, blogs, tabloids, and his areas of research interests are history, archaeology, everyday decoloniality, sociology, critical diversity literacy, Indian ocean studies, and culinary epistemologies, and critical race studies. Thank you, Sayan. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Danille. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much for, first of all, John, Anya, Danille, and Polly for the warm invitation to the space, and also thank you so much, Rozena, for this very interesting and important introduction to our presentation. And I'm really glad that at the very beginning you brought the connection between Bengal and the Cape, and which actually unpacks the foundational ground of our collaborative project of the Palettes of Pleasure, and how do we link South Africa with West Bengal, what we call the place Bengal currently as West Bengal. So what I'm basically going to do over the course of next 15 to 20 minutes is that I'm going to talk specifically about, I would like to address three aspects about why, how, and what. And as I shared that at the beginning, and also Rozena also outlined it in her reflections, that I'm particularly going to talk about the case of Bengal and how the culinary habits, the culinary practices and the food habits were colonized by the Europeans. Rozena mentioned briefly about the Dutch, but there are also infiltrations from other European colonizers as well, like the Danish. Briefly, it was all brief. I mean, the major part of the European colonization as Bengal was from the British, but there were Danish, there were Portuguese, there were French, obviously Rozena mentioned Dutch, but it's mostly the British who had a long period of colonization in Bengal. Now, prior to talking about Bengal, I would like to again give a very brief background about this whole idea of Bengal, because Bengal was the name of the place which is currently known as West Bengal. So Bengal originally during the pre-colonial era and till the point of its partition, this particular place in India, like prior to India's partition into Pakistan and Bangladesh, this particular place was known as Bengal, which was both East Bengal and West Bengal. And then the British partitioned Bengal, and then East Bengal later on became East Pakistan, and then from East Pakistan it became Bangladesh, and West Bengal became a state of like a state in India and in the eastern part of India. So today what we call as West Bengal was actually part of the wider state of Bengal, you know, during the pre-colonial as well as at the time of the colonial era. So the first question, why were the food habits colonized in Bengal? So what were the reasons basically that provoked the European colonizers, specifically the British colonizers, to colonize the food habits in West Bengal? Now, if you know very briefly the whole general history of European colonization across the world, we are also aware of the fact that they used multiple tools of colonization. They used religion, they used anthropology, they used science, they used technology, and obviously food and spices, about which the question of spice trade, Rozena mentioned the aspect of alcoholism, but also about the culture of wine production in South Africa. So food and drinks were also a very important part of this whole colonial project. And so when the British, specifically when the British colonizers came to this particular city of Kolkata in Bengal, which was actually the British capital, so I'm specifically mentioning about the city of Kolkata. What happened was, immediately after arriving in India and also specifically in Bengal, in the city of Kolkata, they could see that there were already the caste, the class, the communal differences were very prevalent and visible out there, which actually the British realized that it is something that is going to add to their advantage of their existence there, because they can use this already existing hierarchies to further divide and rule the whole community in the city of Kolkata and widely in Bengal. So when they started studying, doing a whole lot of research that on what parameters are these hierarchies maintained, one of the major parameters was the food habits and the culinary practices. For instance, and with respect to this, I also need to mention one important aspect, that the whole concept of vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism in India is very complicated. It's not exactly, what we understand by a dictionary definition, that someone who is consuming meat, fish, and eggs are usually considered as non-vegetarians, and somebody who are based on a plant-based diet, they don't consume animal meat of any sort, they are vegetarians. Because it was also about the spices. And why I'm sharing this, because this is very important for us to understand that on the basis of food, what sort of hierarchies were practiced. Now, the highest caste of people, the Brahmins, they called themselves vegetarians, but at the same time, it is important to remember that their concept of vegetarianism is, and still is very much prevalent in many Brahmin communities, not all, but in many Brahmin communities, that they won't use, apart from not consuming meat, fish, and eggs, they won't be using garlic and onion in their food while they prepare their food. Now, garlic and onion are interestingly considered as markers of non-vegetarianism, because in a lot of traditional Indian culinary practices, when we prepare meat and fish and eggs, usually garlic and onion are the basic ingredients there. So garlic and onions, since it is very commonly used, in non-vegetarian food. So amongst many people, especially the Brahmins, it's considered that, if you're using garlic and onion in your food, no matter even if you're just having vegetables, you are basically consuming non-vegetarian food. So when the British, started understanding this complex socio-dynamics of food habits and culinary practices of different castes, classes, and communities, they realized that, it is a very nice way of using gastronomic colonization as a way of, expanding their empire. So we also, if you look at the history of British colonization, what they did is they tried to bring in the Brahmins, who were also by default the landowners, who were known as, the technical term is zamindars. By default, they were the landowners. So the Brahmins and the other high caste people were brought into the British fold, so that, they can use these high caste Indian people to unleash violence on the other low caste and other religious Indian people. And food was one of them, where they encouraged the Brahmins to practice and, kind of enforce their food habits on the rest of the Indian communities, on the rest of the religious communities, on the rest of the caste communities. So that was the one of the many initiating points of unleashing gastronomic colonization, on the people of Bengal, where already it is important to understand the hierarchies were there, but it was with the arrival of the European colonizers, especially the British, who more and more encouraged, the food of the high caste people to be the central norm of culinary practices of the rest of the communities. And that enforcement obviously caused further fractures within different castes, different communities. For example, if you look at the typical diet of what we see of the Muslim people, we also see there is a tendency of using a lot of onion and garlic and ginger in their food. And so again, that became a massive marker, to create these distinctions that, okay, since these people, like the Muslims, the low caste Indians, they consume a lot of garlic and onion and ginger in their food habits and culinary practices. So they are someone to be outcasted. They should be treated as lower to us because our food habits are the most dominant ones. Our food habits are the most pure ones. And as they were being sanctioned by the European colonizers, specifically the British, that became another major tool of confidence for the high caste people. And one thing also, it is important to remember that we all know, especially those who are a bit familiar with the history of South Africa, the colonial history of South Africa, especially at the time of the apartheid era. There were areas division acts, multiple area division acts based on race, based on communities, based on occupations, and many other parameters were followed. In India, we did not have the so-called area division acts, but there were clear distinctions that were made, and still it is very much visible. So for instance, again, if I just give a very specific example, I come from the city of Kolkata. So still, if you go to Kolkata, you will see there are specific places, which is meant exclusively for the Muslim community. There are specific places which is exclusively meant for the Dalits or the outcasts. There are specific places which are predominantly resided by the Brahmins and other high caste Hindu people. And these residencies, these divisions were obviously made on various parameters. For instance, if we read the history of Bengal, we see that there were divisions on the basis of the skin color. So there were places called the black areas, the white areas, and the gray areas. So the gray areas were meant for the Anglo-Indians. For instance, the Anglo-Indian community who had interracial marriages with the white colonizers. In Bengal, they were recognized as gray areas. Or at the same time, divisions were made also based on the religion, based on caste, based on food habits. And it is important to understand that they're all intersected with each other. So, if there is a place which is predominantly resided by the Brahmins, it means that apart from their religious association, apart from their differences and hierarchies in spiritual practices, it is also about their culinary habits, that typical spiritually Puritan ideology that, whatever we eat are the purest form of food, and whatever others eat are always very lower than our own ways of consumption. So this is very important for us to understand. Now, the question is talking about why. I'll quickly move to how these sort of dynamics, how these sort of differences were initiated. And there were, again, multiple parameters were followed. The first were the climatic conditions. And again, I think it's very, very common widely to the African continent as well, where always the African continent in the colonial text have been referred to as a place for the barbarics, for the violent people, for the non-humans. So the environment widely across the world, in fact, was dehumanized and demonized by the European colonizers. The same thing happened in case of India as well. So they said that, Indian food is unhygienic, it's unhealthy, it's spicy, it's not suitable to the climate. But let me share with you a very interesting and at least quite funny in a lot of ways for me. So if you are a little bit acclimatized with the whole connection between climate and food, so if you are a bit, you have a bit of idea, you must be aware of the fact that, in places where the climate is a lot of humid, where you always feel like you're always sweating, you are drenched, in sweat in places, especially which are near the sea regions. For instance, more or less we find this weather in South Africa, in Durban. In the place from where I come from in India is also has a kind of very, very similar kind of weather. There, usually, if you kind of contact the medical experts, they would always say that you need to have soupy vegetables, you need to have soupy fish curry. You should not consume a lot of red meat because that's not good for digestion, especially in such kind of circumstances. Whatever we eat and cook, it should be light for our stomach. It should not hurt our stomach and should be easily digestible. So, a lot of these foods were actually demonized by the colonizers. And, they shared that, oh, these are so unhygienic, these are so spicy, they're very bad for they use all sort of bad spices which are unhealthy. But interestingly, and I read it in, in an Anglo-Indian cookbook where, they have this history that what usually would be the basic breakfast of a British official when he's going to wake up, in the morning to kind of start the day with. And you'd be quite surprised to know that that particular breakfast will be full of varieties of meat and eggs and fish and least number of vegetables and a lot of sugary desserts. Now all of these items, you may ask any medical expert, all of these items, if you are consuming it, waking up in the morning, if you're consuming these food items in a space where you have extreme weather conditions, where you have extreme humid weather conditions, where you are always feeling hot and drenched in sweat, if you consume these foods, these are extremely toxic for the digestion process. So these are the same group of people who in the name of science, who in the name of hygiene demonized our soupy food practices, which are scientific enough to prove why such food items were made. These are the same people who would consume the most unhygienic of all sorts of food items, as a sort of counter to the traditional food practices. So this clearly, there are ample of examples, but I just cited one of these examples that how much irrelevant and illogical their proposals of these European colonizers were to kind of demonize and blame the climatic conditions and the hygienic conditions and try to propose and kind of implement, not in fact propose, kind of to impose their, their food habits on us. And they were also, very, very problematic. They also found, this whole process of, presenting the food patterns, like, we all have a separate kind of food patterns. Like we usually do a starter, we have a main course, we have a dessert. And, in traditional Bengal also, we have this very typical food pattern, very traditional food pattern, that you start with something which is, bitter in taste, and you end up with something which is sour in taste. So usually if you are ever coming to the city of Kolkata or widely any other parts of West Bengal, if you're going to a very traditional local hotel, roadside hotel, they will always serve you the starter with something like a bitter gourd, like a deep fried bitter gourd, which is obviously, if you deep fry it, it is not healthy, but the bitter taste of the bitter gourd is very healthy in the summer season. And then they will and then at the end, they will serve you curd, or whatever we say as plain yogurt, which is sour in taste. Now, why is it so? Again, the point about this is that, especially again, if you're in a hot, humid place, starting the food with bitter taste and ending the food with something sour like a plain yogurt is very good for the sake of digestion. Again, it is very good for digestion, and it is also very healthy. At the same time, it also creates natural body resistance against a lot of diseases and a lot of other forms of health challenges one may encounter during those hot and humid conditions. Such sort of food practices were also demonized to a vast extent. Now, having shared these perspectives, I'll obviously, this is my last slide, and then I'll stop. And then we can open up for the questions and reflections. So now, having identified some of the factors why the colonizers, gastronomically colonized Bengal, and how did they do that? Uh, Here I'm going to briefly talk about. So from here, what is the way forward? So how do we as individuals do address, these sort of dynamics? Because in the present era, also these sort of hierarchies are very much visible. Um, Obviously in different ways, because in the present era, what we see, the colonization is sort of reflected through one's more affinity towards Western branded foods rather than homemade foods. The next way it is visible how some of the foods are racialized and being presented as tasteless just because of its color, because they are dark in color, which is again a racial dynamics of food habit. There are also a lot of ways where it is observed that a lot of these traditional food habits are being invaded by a lot of those Western food habits, which are not medically proven to be healthy. On a lot of occasions, they are unhealthy, but they are just being invaded, made a way through in order to diminish this traditional culinary practices, which are not only suitable to our palates, suitable to our weather conditions, but at the same time, it is also suitable to our body as well. So to counter that, one of the ways of doing is to identify, building and embracing creolized culinary practices. Obviously, while we discuss and we talk, I'll talk more on that because there is a lot to say about that. But just to be very brief and simple, it is about blending various forms of food practices, not only in terms of taste, but also in terms of health and other social, cultural, economic, and various other factors that contribute towards developing different sorts of food habits. Another important point is one of our colleagues whom Rozena also knows well. Kashyap is also a contributor to our project Palettes of Pleasure. I draw with respect to her work where she talks about understanding kitchen space as a methodology of interwoven knowledge performances, where kitchen is not just for cooking certain kind of foods, but also it's about the interplay of various spices, interplay of various stories, various histories, and various narratives. And when a food is cooked inside the kitchen, it is not just the spices, it is not just the various amount of taste that goes in, it is also various forms of cultures, traditions, race, histories that are poured into that pot while the cooking process goes on. So a kitchen space is a very hierarchically interwoven space. And the next is obviously Ananya Jahanara Kabir, another fantastic scholar who works on Creole food practices and widely on Creole cultures. She talks about archipelagos of cultural practices. So where we just don't look at different food habits as one over the other, not just in the hierarchical process, but we try to look at it as the archipelagos of culinary practices, like they are existing in their own respective spaces. They are existent, within their respective borders, but at the same time, they're also free to interact with each other. And that is being welcoming towards being, being warm and invitational towards each other's culinary practices and food habits, which is, more or less that draws into the concept of archipelagos of culinary practices. And then the last point is obviously critical food studies, which has actually developed. It's kind of a upcoming and quite widely growing way of understanding food. I mean, I know in South Africa, there is a wonderful critical food studies organization that has been doing a lot of work around food studies and understanding taste in connection with caste, class, culture, race, politics, economics, and various other factors, where we just don't understand food for the sake of taste, not just for the sake of health, but also trying to understand various tastes and various spices and various culinary cultures within these broader parameters of our surrounding experiences. I think I'll stop here. I think I've spoken a lot. I'll stop here. I mean, there is a lot of things to share about, as Rozena mentioned right at the beginning, but we are very happy to take questions, reflections, comments, agreements, disagreements, whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sayan and Rozena. So I'd like to open it up for anyone that has any questions for the two of them.
Danille, while we wait for questions, I just want to share an anecdote. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. When I first went to, I don't know, I'm trying to adjust the light. When I first went to study in the UK on a British Council scholarship, it was 1987. And I was taken aback that some of the English students or, who were studying with me at the University of York in the UK, some of the main interest was to point out how very English I was, which was a big shock to me. And for example, they were saying to me things like, "Oh, but you like to drink tea," and I said yes. And they would say, "Oh, but that's so English," and I said, "How? Do you grow tea in England? No. They have boxes of Ceylon, which is basically the name that the British gave to Sri Lanka. The British do not grow tea. South Africans, we grow tea. India grows tea. Sri Lanka grows tea. But so they have all these boxes of Ceylon tea or the best tea from Ceylon, and even like the Earl Grey tea. And when you look at the box, it will say Earl Grey is beautifully curated from various amounts of tea, and they give all the regions that the tea comes from. Sri Lanka and other parts of their colonial empire, and so I said this to these three women who were on my program, and they just said, "Oh, but we just thought it grew in England." I said, "No, you don't have tea here." So what is often seen as like British or Dutch, or for example, Italian. Marco Polo spent 17 years in China. Italians had no pasta culture. And then when they colonized East Africa, we see a lot of the pasta in the Somalian and, the Eritrean dishes, because there's just this assumption, and this is same with coffee. Coffee has been grown in Java since the beginning of time. The first person to open a coffee shop in London was actually a Lebanese man. So the Ethiopians and Eritreans and East Africans have had coffee since the beginning of time. And when people used to joke and they say, "Oh God, I can't think straight if I don't have my cup of Java," what they meant was, the cup of coffee, because coffee, Java was one of the main places of coffee, which also made it one of the main Indonesian spots to colonize. So I just wanted to bring that anecdote that often we as the colonized are spoken to as though somehow we've adopted colonial habits and not the other way around, So yeah.
Thank you, Rozena. I think it's very true. I mean, we don't always think about why we're eating certain things or where it's coming from. You just, sometimes it's so instinctual almost, but not to hog the space. Kate, you had a question, or you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I had a question. I mean, I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm doing my master's in the UK, and just wanted to give some context. And I was really curious because, like, in my life, and especially like in sort of my exploration of activism in the UK, I've run into a very strong sense of like in-group fighting with other minority groups, particularly like, like white women or like Black women. Because I think it goes back to this idea that maybe slavery was worse than colonialism, and that, like we, as in Bengalis, were never slaves or enslaved. And I mean, you don't really like, I know that what your dialogue today is about food, but I was just curious, like if, as people who've thought about Bengal and like colonialism in general, you had any thoughts about this, because I'm kind of struggling. Like I would need some guidance actually. I could use some guidance. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'll let them think about it before they respond. Let me just get Alyona. Do you want to ask also?
Yeah,
You
my
muted.
question, yeah. Thank you for the talk. My question is about the broader topic. Actually, it's about coffee, because I'm doing research about post-colonial, coffee industry, and I was very interested. Maybe you have some materials about, the, I don't know, the effect of colonial practices on the economics of the countries, or I don't know, something broader. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's just one question in the chat so far that says, does the culinary practice of bitter to sour come from the Ayurveda practices? So Sayan and Rozena, you may answer.
I don't know, Rozena, would you like to go ahead first? And then obviously I can jump in or whatever ways you want to.
Okay, just with respect to Kate's question, I think, Kate, when you're coming from another country into the UK, it is a culture shock. It's a culture shock just in so many different ways. I mean, I'm just going to say, even in 1987, for me, it was a big culture shock because I had lived in a communal house with 4 other women. And so we shared everything. We shared food. One of us would cook every day, or whoever came home first. This is when I was a student. And then we would cook and just share food. But in the UK, in my experience, when I was sort of arrived, people don't greet you. And it's not necessarily because they're being nasty. It's greeting and saying hello. Is, how are you? It's in some cultures, it doesn't happen. And so immediately you feel that sense of alienation. Like, what have I done? What have I said? I'm just greeting you. I don't want anything from you. And whenever you speak of people who identify as people of color, you will hear, whether it's people who identify as Black and as people of color, you will hear people say, I've moved to the UK or any other European place, and I feel very alienated. Secondly, I think some of what you are experiencing is precisely what made the British so good in their colonial pursuits, is the question of divide and conquer. So even in South Africa, during and prior, during, and even now, the national liberation struggle, divide and conquer was so important for the colonizers. So I was going to say earlier on, so when the Dutch had colonized Malaysia, they also made sure that they brought, so in the Cape, the classification is Cape Malay, so Malay meaning Muslim from Malaysia, because there's a particular style of cooking that comes from the Muslim Malay, Malaysian community that's different from the Hindu Javanese community. So they were very calculated in their choices, and they were very calculated in the manner in which they continued the divide and conquer. So even in the UK, you'll find people who are, part of the larger oppressed internationally, globally, and the larger colonized will have that, because in some way, we talk about decolonization, and this is my little spiel, and we forget that even the word colonize has the word colon in it, which is the most important body part that regulates and controls. And colonization, as Steve Biko said very clearly, is not only about the language and the palate, it's also about your mind. So often the many communities who go to the site of the empire, the belly, the stomach, whatever you want to call it, still have that sense of, I'm not saying you doing this, I'm giving a broad picture of wanting to say, look, I'm human, you know, look at me, see me, I'm human. And of course, the impact that that has on your body, because you're also fighting, you know, a colonizer who isn't necessarily the colonizer that colonized you, but the extent of that colonial presence, and that colonizer's presence, you feel it everywhere. In the UK, everywhere you walk, everywhere you look, there's the statues, there's the Imperial War Museum. I go there, you know, but I mean, to look at, you know, different kinds of archives and whatever, but there's always that sense in which you're just a speck of dust in the bigger picture. And so when people together in their own communities of struggle, feel that belittling, that alienation, they turn on one another. You know, this is a fact that we've seen throughout South Africa as well. I'm going to, I wasn't sure if, Alyona, if you're doing your research on coffee, is that what you were saying? Yeah, so I think I will pick up a few things and maybe send it to one of the organizers. There is quite a bit of work that's been done on it. And I'm going to say there's also a lot of work done in Colombia on coffee, believe it or not, some of which is interwoven with the history of Pablo Escobar, you know. So yes, so I will be able to follow up with you through one of the organizers. Sayan, I've spoken too long, so I'll leave that to you, the rest to you.
No, I think you actually shared very important points, Rozena. This is very very helpful, and I would just like to, in continuation to what Rozena responded to Kate's question, I'll just like to add, in the very context of how racism and food has always been very much interlinked. And briefly, obviously, I have spoke about that whole sort of caste differences and dividing food habits in terms of caste, and often castes were also racialized and races were also castified in India. And also, I'm pretty sure it's also very relevant in the context of Bangladesh as well. And now the point is, when we address the question of race, obviously I won't be as in a good position as Rozena, who has been in UK for a very long time, knows about the various deep cultural aspects, the deep political structures and the social dynamics out there. But I can come in with this aspect that when we usually address the issue of race, we hardly bring this aspect of food differences as well. And so the question that you raised, that Bengalis were not enslaved enough, they kind of escaped this whole cobweb of racism, that this sort of narrative has always been very problematic. And this is one of the major reasons why still when we read about the history of the arrival of Indian indentured laborers in South Africa, a majority of the histories, because currently my postdoctoral project centers on this aspect, a majority of the histories begin with 1860s, which is very problematic. But long before that, Dutch colonization actually brought people from India, and especially it was the Bengali slaves who were brought to the Cape as indentured laborers. And now obviously, who were more enslaved, who were less enslaved, it is itself a problematic question for me, because we don't know how do we bring out the parameters of who was more and who was less. But yes, the enslavement was there. The history has been there.
Can I interject here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, because you know, because I quoted I'm Cesar in a recent debate I did at the Cambridge Union. And I was just, and you know, I noticed that what he calls colonialism slavery, he says force, you know, and I just found that to be kind of telling in terms of not necessarily separating the degrees of servitude, but just understanding the nature of it. And also the second thing that I would really love to share is like, actually my background is that I was born in a Bangladeshi family. My parents were interfaith. My father came from Muslim side and my mother came from Hindu side. And then I was adopted by a Jewish American woman and a Welsh Cypriot man. And yeah, I mean, it's just like kind of interesting to be in that space because I always think of myself as like the Jews and the Bengalis having played a similar role in history, particularly the Bengali Hindus, because my biological paternal side actually disowned me, like they just abandoned me, the Muslim side. But then the maternal side was there, and you know the Jews and the Bengali Hindus, I think, played a very similar role, as a Jewish woman in San Francisco pointed out to me once from Russia. But yeah, I mean that's kind of like the, I guess, confluence of identities I'm trying to make sense of, but also like I really want freedom. I want freedom for everyone, you know. Yeah.
Kate, can I just quickly say, Kate,
Yes.
welcome to the community of struggle. Welcome. We all have similar histories overlapping in some way. And I think lots of folks here, I don't know everybody's history, but the reason we do this kind of work is because we come from places, we come from communities of struggle in some form or another, whether this is around race, identity, gender, sexuality. This is why we do this kind of work. So you're not alone. I'm just going to say that. All right, you're not alone.
Yes, and also I'll just quickly move to the next question as well. But also I think food is it's important that more and more we should invite each other to think that how food should be understood, the aspects of culinary practice, they should be understood in intersection with the question of race and gender and color and sexuality and various other aspects. And that's why towards the end of the presentation, I was just briefly mentioned about the necessity of engaging more and more with critical food studies. I think Aliona's question was already answered by Rozena. So I'll just quickly move to the other question, which was there in the chat box. I think somebody just asked about if this habit of consuming bitter and sour comes from Vedic food practices. So again, let me tell you about this. This is again this is the usual belief, but it is a very problematic belief because obviously the consumption of the traditional Bengali practice of having sour and sweet and bitter on the same plate, it was mentioned in certain Vedic practices, but assigning it exclusively that it has been drawn from the Vedic practices is very problematic because there are quite a few evidences that even prior to the evolution of Vedas and their reflections in food, there have been various religious texts. There have been various culinary texts. Obviously, they never existed as cookbooks at that point of time because cookbooks was not a fashion at that point of time. But then at that point of time, religion and food habits intersected with each other. And there they very categorically mention about the necessity, and there were medical texts as well, which also talks about the best sort of food habits in the weather conditions. That talks about the necessity of consuming sour and bitter food at the same time, and to begin with bitter food and end with sour food. So obviously they were mentioned in the Vedas, but to try to interpret it as being drawn from the Vedas exclusively is problematic.
Thank you, Sayan and Rozena. Before I go to your question, Nazneen, I just want to read a comment from Jan. I'm probably saying this name wrong. He says he's from northern Russia, and there was no slavery like in all Russia. People who lived by the sea were called pomors, and fish and sea animals made them well, or well, led to well-being, I'm assuming, and it was a tradition. In the times of Soviet revolution, there were many people against the new regime and nationalization. We understand your story. I don't know if you want to elaborate on it or you just wanted to make the comment. Okay. And then Nazneen, you
I
can
don't know,
ask.
Rozena, would you like to share something?
Not right now. There's some similarities about the strandlopers from the Cape, but I think we should just go to Nazneen.
Yes, I mean, obviously, like quickly to share with Jan that, I mean, obviously, personally, I don't know about this aspect. Thank you for sharing this very important historical perspective from Russia, from northern part of Russia. And also it has, you know, it's also interesting to see the overlaps in certain aspects, like how politics, food habits and cultural practices and colonization just, you know, intersects with each other across various geographical dimensions in different contexts for sure, but is always there around. So thank you, Jan, for sharing this narrative.
You can go ahead, Nazneen.
Hi, actually, I'm doing PhD in the representation of Bengali culinary culture on digital platforms. So I have been following all the cultural historiographers. So it's just a comment because if you find Shrirupa Prasad works or Bhaskar Mukhopadhyay's work, they have written mentionally how this, especially these upper caste Brahmins, how they played politics over these two special tastes. One is tamarind and another one is chili. So they have mentioned it properly in a very depth that how it has come taken from the Vedic traditions and how they use this special particular taste it to create the differentiation. And another thing, there is Shrirupa Prasad's work. She analyzed all the cookbooks written during the late colonial period, all the Bengali cookbooks and how it has been written. So it's not about this taste, but somehow this vulnerable body has also played a greater role in deciding this whole food politics. Because in India, before Bengal, it's all the rural area. The city has never been built. So when people were migrating to city and they were not doing more physical labor and just doing the official works, so the health started deteriorating. And there are other kind of things like the process of adulteration in food that has also increased a lot. So they've tried to bring many revolutions acts to stop that adulteration process, but it couldn't happen. So there are a lot of things. It's not just one thing or two things, but as Sayan said, it's a lot of things that has gathered together. So I'm just asking one question, Sayan. Right now, what you were looking at in that culinary practice of food politics in Bengal? That's what I'm interested to know right now.
Yes, thank you, Nazneen, for the question. And also thank you for sharing once again this this whole aspect of intersectionality that is all linked up with various aspects of our food cultures. At present, what I'm currently looking at is one aspect, some of the foods that we consider as, or we have a false notion that they are traditionally Bengali. Why they are not traditionally Bengali food? They're very much Creole foods, and that's why I was talking more about the Creole foods. For example, I'll just use you know, those traditional terms, and I'll try to explain in English because it's always very difficult to find the right words and phrases, but I'll try my best to do that. One is something called shukto, which is very traditionally Bengali as believed. But what is shukto? First of all, let me tell you, it's kind of a mixed veg. You got a lot of vegetables, but one major ingredient of shukto is bitter gourd. It should have a sort of bitter taste. And then it is, you know, cooked sometimes with poppy seed paste and milk and a lot of other things, which is very considered as traditionally Bengali. But the question is, you know, it is not, because the whole concept of shukto emerged from the Portuguese, because in Portugal there is still the culture of using bitter gourds in salads, and which actually, when they came to Bengal, they tried to initiate that, but they couldn't, kind of converse that properly to the cooks. And when they went into the kitchen, they said something, they brought out something else, and that was the shukta. And it has happened with many other food items. We also have something called, the potole dorma. This potole is again a sort of gourd. I don't know what is exactly the name of that gourd, which is not again common in South Africa. So, but it's a kind of gourd where you stuff, you remove the seeds from the middle and you stuff maybe with whatever you want to. You can stuff with vegetables, you can stuff with cheese, you can stuff with meat, you can stuff with fish, whatever you want to stuff with. Again, that is considered very Bengali and traditional, but again, that's not traditional. That is very slightly Danish, slightly Anglo-Indian in nature. So this is one of the many aspects I'm trying to do, the Creole foods. When we are talking about decolonizing food habits, my question is, again, I'm talking from my respective context, is it really possible to make us very clear-cut distinction that this is colonial food, this is decolonial food, so we should do away with this colonial thing, we keep this decolonial thing? Is it possible? At least my research with Creole foods, because it also connects to my research with the Creole food practices in South Africa as well, which actually, what Rozena mentioned about the Cape Malay cuisine, like it is drawn from so many dimensions. You can find a bit of Malaysian taste, you can find a bit of Bengali taste, you can find a bit of North Indian food taste, you can find local South African spices. It's so diverse, and so in such a kind of condition, how do we understand, contest with this whole notion of, colonial food and decolonial food? This is one of the aspects I'm trying to look at. And then the other aspect in connection to this, how the various colonial food habits and the culinary practices which were imposed on us continues through our habitual practices, which are widely driven now by caste and communal reasons. But it is not just about the caste and communal factors, but if you look deep into their history, somewhat we see that the influence and the impact of the colonizers are very much out there. So these are the two major things that I'm trying to look at with respect to food habits and culinary practices in the context of Bengal.
Thank you so much, Sayan and Rozena. I just want to check, is there any more questions from anyone?
So I have just one thing. So many critics, they say, especially if you come to the southern India part, they say, okay, if you are decolonizing everything, like we are removing the colonial influence, or we are trying to analyze the colonial things, but what then? After that, what? Again, we are going back to the caste system. Like this kind of questions arises when you talk about these food habits or cultural practices. So this kind of things, like it's not just one thing, but how is it possible to address all of the kind of thing? That's also there.
No, absolutely. I mean, maybe I would also invite Rozena to talk about that because, because of a brief Indian ancestry, she may also, comment about it. But I would like to talk about, first of all, this whole process of decolonization is an ongoing, incomplete process. So, the question of then what comes when we try to put a full stop to a project, we say that, okay, we have done this, so the process of decolonization is over. The moment we say this, which is very problematic, that is from where this question stems out, then what? So it is important for us to understand that this whole process of decolonization is an incomplete ongoing process, number one. Number two, going back to caste differences, communal differences on the plates is never ever what is decolonization. Unfortunately, this is what is being done right now by the right-wing idealists in India. That's a problem. So that is where Creole foods comes as a form of resistance. Because in terms of Creole foods, what happens is it is very difficult to make a distinction inside a particular food item that this is Brahmanical, this is Muslim, this is Christian, this is whatever, high caste, low caste. So Creole food practice is a form of practice. Now, for instance, like, a lot of food items, and this is why to develop this consciousness towards Creole food items is necessary, because a lot of times we don't realize, we try to understand something which is as as something which is pure Brahmin food or a pure, let us say, a Muslim food or a pure Dalit food. But if we try to look into the history, we realize that no, there is no purity in it. This is all very mixed up. So, this historical consciousness is very necessary. And that is, again, why we need to go back to this question about, this critical food studies, which invites us to understand food in these intersectional ways and question these often false approaches towards decolonization. So maybe, I don't know, Rozena, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think the question of, okay, so we've done this, so what now? First of all, I'm going to say, as somebody who works within the university context, I consider myself a teacher, and also who has research projects with schools. So 2013, we had a BCO project, and we started a BCO project and a gender-based violence project for the same reason that I'm going to say to you. The decolonial projects are also first and foremost about restoring knowledge and misinformation. So, when my students ask me, why are we always depicted on the African continent as poor? It's my job as a teacher to say, we were never poor. The African continent, with all of its 56 countries and territories and, and islands, were never poor. I mean, Europeans came to the African continent for raw material. They were the ones starving. They were the ones with plagues. They were the ones with huge populations dying. They were the ones who didn't have food. So, you don't run after a man with broken shoes. They came to the African continent, Europeans, uninvited. Nobody invited them. They came uninvited because when the knowledge, look at what happened in the Congo. 10 million people were killed. Look at what happened in Namibia between 1903 and 1907, when the Germans colonized the Second Reich, Namibia, to have a nice, wonderful little experiment before they inflicted that experiment on Jewish people in Europe. So it's about knowledge production, creation, knowledge retrieval, knowledge that was hidden and forbidden and repressed. It's also about ensuring that our identities are, enriched by this knowledge. For example, we have colonized communities of struggle who have struggled with their identity, with this notion somehow that we were either poor or we were savages or we were uncouth, eating with our hand, But when you look at the history of cutlery, in the UK, where's cutlery made? What was the knife used for? Why did only the upper class eat with cutlery? Why the switching of the hands? Why the knife was in the left hand? Because people killed each other as well, stabbed each other with cutlery. So I think first and foremost, I'm going to just say it's about all of those things that the decolonial imperative is necessary. I'm also going to say I've had people ask me similar questions about critical race theory. And we know the debate in the United States. So many schools and high schools and there's an onslaught by the right wing to say we don't need critical race theory because, of course, if you tell people of color, oppressed and colonized people, what is your true history, then we empower people. And you can't empower people of color in the US or Africans, African Americans, because they will just take over, right? So the fear is that once you restore dignity, once you restore human rights, once you restore the strategic loss or withholding of information and knowledge, you also give the very people you've oppressed, you give them a certain sense of power. And just one last anecdote. So several years ago in South Africa, the question arose around, Afrikaner white identity, like how white are you really? Because obviously Afrikaners look very different to the Dutch population. And so W.E.B. de Klerk, who was the last white president of South Africa, and Eugene de Blanche, which is basically the head of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, which is the Afrikaner, what they call resistance movement. They had the same, what is called stammoeder, ancestral mother. And that ancestral mother was a Bengali woman called Catherine. So here you have, you know, the head of a right-wing neo-Nazi, what is the group they have in the United States again? The far right, the Ku Klux Klan, so something similar. So here you have the head of this movement whose mother was a previously enslaved Bengali woman, you know? And then you look at various other former prime ministers in South Africa, and, you know, because there's a whole group of people who did this archival and, you know, excavation of knowledge to say, hey, these guys are not as white as they claim to be, you know, and found out that many of their ancestral mothers were Black indigenous women. So the idea, I mean, why people try to stop this is because A, it will take away from the white population the false assumptions, or what Jacques Derrida often refers to as white mythology, that somehow the existence is steeped in superiority, prowess, authority, you know, that they have the right to claim the term human. So I think this is, as Sayan said, it's a process. It's not something that has a beginning and end. It is an ongoing process. We learn things about ourselves and one another from across the globe. There's some things I wanted to chat with. I don't know if it was Jan or Alden who had mentioned about the community by the coast. That community was wiped out by the Dutch colonizers in South Africa, communities who lived by the sea, fishing communities who basically fished and lived and then would go to different beaches. I think in California, the term beachcomber is used, obviously a very different context and history, but similar in the sense that these were communities who saw their lifestyle as without the boundaries of you know, Western civilization in some way, but also wanted to have a particular kind of freedom to live the way they wanted to. So there are many reasons for us doing this work, and there is no full stop or end or limitation as far as I'm concerned. So thanks.
Thank you, Rozena and Sayan. There's just one last comment by Jan. I'm saying your name probably very wrong, but you're welcome to speak. He just wants to comment on Russia.
It's a great pleasure, and you name my name correct.
Thank you.
But in United States, my name is Ian also. But well, it's a great pleasure and the interest to share the knowledge, and for me it's very interesting because my sphere of PhD research and study is it's rural entrepreneurship and social sustainable relationships and development. So and in our area in northern Russia, in northern Arctic, we have a very difficult period of returning the owner or the host of the land. So and the food in this sense is a very very important element, because Pomors in our area and nearby we have the Russian indigenous people of the north. With them I'm also working actively, Nenets people and the other people who do reindeer herding. So they also do a lot to not to lose their culture and not to lose their identity, because this culture is also diminishing and for reindeer herders here in Russia, in Nenets language, the word ellipse, called life, is the same as a reindeer, because reindeer for them is everything. It's food, it's house, like a house Nenet chum, like wigwam for Native Americans. So, and in India case, it's very interesting because I have my friend in Calcutta. We used to communicate a lot still. So I just want to say that your cases, your experience is very close and understandable for us here. So we also have the problem of diminishing culture and the need to save the food. I would say that for me it's still a question why here we don't return so much to our traditional food. I mean, this is not so well promoted. I mean, and this is not so good researched. So, and what happens now in this sense, in connection with food, that I think it's on one hand good, but it must be analyzed also. It's Russia is a special country. We have Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the most population is concentrated in capital, and now we have the process of ruralization. So people from megapolises, from these 2-3 big cities, they run or escape to rural areas to find something in connection with their roots, or just to recover, just to live. So for me, the presentation today were very interesting, and Pamor houses, they are left not so many. They used wood for the construction. They didn't use nails, and they had special boats which they used for traveling from Arkhangelsk to Spitsbergen to do the trade with Norwegians. So and this is also part of the history we still remember, and not only with Norwegians. My town was the first port in Russia, and we opened the trade with the Germans, with the Dutch, with the British. It was 16th century. So, and it's also an important part for our history. And it's a pleasure to have such a brief speech, and I'm very happy to know you, and I'm open to new contacts and communications, and best regards from Russia and from White Sea and from the Arctic.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that. I think that closes off the session quite nicely, is that just because we're talking about Bengal or South Africa, it doesn't mean that Russia or any other place doesn't have similar issues in terms of culture, food, and like you're saying, things diminishing. So thank you everyone for attending. Please look at the NYI site. We will be posting more stuff, and we will continue the decolonial dialogues in some or other form. Thank you very much, Sayan and Rozena. I don't know if you want any last comments, very short, because we've run out of time. But thank you everyone for attending. I think this was really very interesting, very fruitful.
No, happy to be part of this group and participating and engaging with others doing similar kind of work. So yeah, my pleasure, and happy to do that. And I will send some information to John and to Mary, I think, to whoever then contacts them to disseminate that. I'm happy with that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you, once again, for being there, for your reflections, questions, and arguments, which actually just kind of reminds me that every time it's going to remind me that we have so much work to do together across the world in our respective contexts. And as we were talking, Rozena also mentioned, Jan also mentioned, all of us more or less mentioned that it's a never-ending dialogue. It's a dialogue for sure, but it's a never-ending dialogue. So we are very sure we are going to continue it across different spaces and different points of time. But thank you once again, all of you, for being there, for having us in this wonderful space. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all, and have a good night or morning or afternoon, wherever you find yourselves. Thank you and bye.